Hi, welcome back, everybody. And next up for today, we have Melissa Eggleston, who joins us from North Carolina in the United States. Melissa is a UX designer for the US Digital Service, a government department using design and technology to deliver better services to the American people. In her spare time, Melissa founded BirdCool. BirdCool serves organizations making a positive difference in the world. Recent projects include designing an app to help human trafficking survivors and developing content strategy for a global health organization. Fun fact, Melissa once knocked herself unconscious while riding a skateboard at age 30. And no, she was not doing a trick. If anything, I think that's impressive, actually, Melissa. Everybody, please welcome Melissa.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here with y'all. Hello from North Carolina. Some of you may not have any idea where that is. We're kind of halfway in between New York and Miami over in the United States. You'll notice my accent is different than y'all's. I've been enjoying listening to you today, and I'm excited about some of the sessions coming up too. So let me grab my slides and I'm going to share them with you. Give me a moment to do that. Here we go. Okay, so let's talk about trauma-informed design. So I want to start off by, let's all take a collective deep breath together. And just know that talking about trauma can bring things up for us. And that can be really unpredictable. So I want you to know you have options here, right? At any time, you can step away. You can decide, I'm going to watch this later on, or take some deep breaths, have a sip of water, because it just kind of brings up stuff for people. And that's okay. That's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable, but if you find yourself, with short breath and feeling really agitated, that might be a trauma response. So, I encourage you to take care of yourself. So this is what I'm going to try to cover in 30 minutes. Sometimes I talk about this topic for 2 hours, so I'm going to try to jam a lot in here quickly. How I got into this, what is trauma? What am I talking about when I'm saying trauma-informed? What are some of the principles of that kind of approach that you can apply to tech? How are some of the ways, I've applied it? And then I've got some resources for you to learn more. I've got a whole bunch of them that I hope some of you will feel inspired and will dig in this area, because we need a lot of help, because there's a lot of trauma in the world. So I first learned about trauma on this playground, about what trauma-informed even meant. And this is my child's, she's now 10, but this was her preschool playground. And nobody tells you when you're going to have a child that you're going to have to revisit different periods that you went through in your own childhood. And people just don't talk about that. They just want to buy you baby gifts and tell you that's going to be great and all that kind of thing. And it is great. And it was really hard because growing up in a home with a lot of stuff going on, like domestic violence, when my daughter came along, all of a sudden, all this stuff was coming up for me too. And there was another mom who happened to be on this playground who was a educator around childbirth, and she would go talk to nurses and doctors and talk to them about being more trauma informed and being especially sensitive to people who'd gone through any kind of sexual trauma that, goodness, this could be coming up during childbirth. And I can remember listening to her and being like, what are you talking about? What is this trauma informed? This seems really important, and I've never heard this word before at all. And that's kind of how it started. And, like a good UXer, you ask, what do you mean by that? And she started to explain it to me how, a nurse can act more trauma-informed if, for example, he or she, and they are asking questions and explaining, are they writing down answers to these questions? Is it going to be stored in a health system? If these are sensitive questions, especially about, past sexual history or abuse or any of that, where is this information going? So explaining that to somebody would be a more trauma-informed way to approach it. A police officer could be more trauma-informed, perhaps, if they came and were helping out at a crime scene and there were small children involved. Instead of towering over them to tell them something, that police officer might actually bend down and get level with the kids and come not from such a authoritative kind of approach, and try to speak gently with them. So that would be a trauma-informed thing. So what I basically got from talking with her multiple times on the playground was that it kind of felt like good conversation. And I'd read this book called Letting Go of the Words that maybe some of you read. Ginny Reddish is a contemporary of Steve Krug. So if you read Don't Make Me Think, this is kind of like somebody else who's got like tons of experience. And so this is a great book I would recommend. And I'm kind of remembering that she was always talking about like a good website is a good conversation. And that's what my friend, this educator was talking about too. Like, how do you have a good conversation so that at the end, somebody doesn't feel like, ugh, you know, like I just told them all this information and I don't even know where it's going. And I always thought like a website should feel like that. It should feel human and friendly and positive, a positive experience. So I just started thinking a lot about like, how does this all apply to tech? And I ended up getting I ended up going for this grant to help the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence, helping them learn how they could make their website more trauma-informed. Because when I went to their website, I saw triggering images, I found broken links, it didn't work well on mobile, there were like all these issues, and I was like, dang, like, I don't even know much about being trauma-informed, but I don't think this is it. And that's kind of where we are in this world of like tech and being trauma-informed. There's lots of examples of like, well, I know that's not it. And so we need to like pay attention to this area, because this area has been on the rise in healthcare and in social work since like 2000, like especially in the last 10 years though. You know, when I first was digging into this around 2015, 2016, I couldn't find anything online about it except from like one, it was like a national network against domestic violence organization in the United States who was talking about tracking and GPS. But trauma is everywhere. And it's something for us to think about, regardless of whether we're working with a group that a group of participants or desired audience who happens to be, we know, have gone through traumatic events. You know, trauma is really like all over the place. But you might be wondering, like, what do you even mean by that word? Because we all have different ideas in our head, and that's okay. But let me just define for you kind of the definition that I've been using. And it's just the simplest one I could come up with. It's shortened from the American Psychological Association, called the APA here. And it's an emotional response to a terrible event. So what I like about this is that it's actually about the response, and it's not necessarily about the event. There are certainly some events that are absolutely out of the norm of human experience and that we would all agree are terrible. But trauma is more nuanced than that. And just because somebody has gone through an event that happens to, you know, maybe be traumatic for most people doesn't necessarily mean like you're going to develop PTSD or have traumatic responses. And that is the tricky thing about trauma. It is not, it is as unique as the people out there. It's just so different. So I wanted to tell you this story. That's my husband on the one side of me, and that's my daughter when she was young on the other side of me. And on Christmas 2015, we had decided to take a walk. We were waiting for some grandparents to come for a visit. And, you know, my daughter was little, and we grabbed our dog and just like went for a little walk around the neighborhood because it was actually fairly warm. And we made it like 2 houses down, not very far at all. And all of a sudden this very large dog like jumped the fence and came right up to us, right next to our dog. And later on, my husband and I talked, and we had this moment where we were like, maybe this dog isn't going to attack. And then, of course, like that was wishful thinking. It was scary. It was, you know, my husband ended up in the hospital. The dog ended up in the hospital. It was blood. It was screaming. It was like chaos. I was so grateful my daughter was like 20 feet behind us because she probably didn't want to go on a walk. And everybody was okay in the long run. Everybody was okay. And from that event, you might think anytime that like my daughter was around a dog, she might have a scared reaction. You know, she might remember this and go, ugh. But that isn't what happened. My husband, I mentioned this event to, I guess it was last year sometime, and he's like, oh, I forgot about that. And I'm like, wow, you were like the main player. You doesn't even remember it. And I think about it. I think about it every Christmas. And I don't know why we all react different ways we do. We're still learning about trauma. It certainly depends on past experiences. For my daughter, she was able to talk to grandparents right afterwards. She was able to process really quickly. Maybe that helped her. Maybe I remember it because I was knocked down by a German Shepherd when I was 8 years old. I don't know. We're not really sure. But what I'm trying to get to is that what might not be a big deal to you might be a big deal to someone else. And so we need to be thinking about that just like, you know, if you've ever run usability tests, which I'm sure many of you have, people do all kinds of surprising things. Everybody reacts a little bit differently to situations. So I wanted to call attention to this guy, Vincent Folletti. He is a doctor in the United States who's now like retired, but he's from San Diego, and he created this study called the ACEs study that I'm going to go into. I'm going to explain what ACEs are. And it was like radical and a major shift in healthcare. And what's interesting is he was running an obesity clinic in the United States, and he kept having these people who would lose 100 pounds, would be like going along very successfully about their lives, losing weight, that sort of thing. And then they would just drop out of the clinic. And he was like, what is going on? So I can't tell you the whole story because I actually start crying when I do. So I've linked to it in the resources, and I encourage you to read the whole story. But the bottom line is that by misspeaking, he discovered that actually sexual abuse was involved in a lot of these obesity patients. They had a history of having serious trauma. And this was like a surprise. Like nowadays, maybe we think, well, of course, things that happen when you're a kid are going to affect you as an adult and that sort of thing. But this was like the 80s, y'all. So things were a little bit different. We're not thinking about that. And he ended up running this study with 17,000 people and started looking at things that happened in childhood, how they affected health outcomes. There's a direct link between childhood trauma and adult onset of disease, as well as things like mental illness, work issues, cognitive issues, all kinds of different things. And there were a lot of adults who've experienced some kind of adverse childhood experiences. It indicates mental issues, social issues, all kinds of different stuff. These are like just general things that we need to think about. And there's a list of them here. And in the resources, I'm going to ask you to like look at those, and you can take a quiz to kind of think about how these affect you. You might have 1, you might have 2, I have 6, you might have 8. It doesn't really matter, but I'm going to ask you to like, don't think about your ACEs right now because you'll have the chance to do that in just a little bit, because I want to talk about how this relates to kind of what we do. So that study tended to be very like middle class white study in the United States. And so some smart people in Philadelphia said, hey, you know what, there's other kinds of ACEs, there's other kinds of adverse experiences that affect people. And they came up with these other 5. So these are kind of an expanded idea of ACEs. We know there's things like racial trauma, historical trauma that's also experienced by groups of people. So we need to be mindful of that as well. A lot of being trauma-informed is like paying attention and thinking a little bit more carefully about groups who maybe don't look like you necessarily. Trauma is also an equity issue. So there's a lot of intersection between being trauma-informed, making things accessible, being inclusive, being equitable. If you're working in any of those areas, this is good. You're like heading in the right way, I think. Racism is certainly trauma, right? There's some stats, these are mostly from the United States, right? But that PTSD is more common in certain groups that tend to be more vulnerable and get a lot of exposure to violence at times. And these are generalizations, but you can kind of see from the slide that trauma is an equity issue. I hope you agree with me on that. And there's, if anybody's interested too, I have different studies I can send you to. So we care about this because this is this interesting, kind of reminds me of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but this has to do with adverse childhood experiences and kind of how they affect us throughout our lives. So adverse childhood experiences, these ACEs, come in these bottom 3 layers, right? The place you grew up, the zip code, you didn't choose that. You just ended up somewhere, and you're going to have experiences. There may be things that happened in your home. There's all kinds of trauma. There's complex trauma of things that are repeated. There's the trauma that just happens in one-time events, be it a natural disaster or a car accident or whatever happens to be. And what happens is in here, it starts to mess sometimes with our cognitive development, right? So this is where it comes into play for designers of websites and apps that people might be using. And we need to be keeping in mind, oh, wow, maybe somebody might be affected by trauma. And I'm not just talking about people who are in the middle of trauma. I'm talking about 20 years later even. These things can have lasting effects on our brains. And we want to pay attention to like the research that's out there. So here are some of the long-lasting effects. Issues with memory, issues with attention, issues with planning, and issues with problem solving. So when somebody's coming to a website, be it a government website or some other kind of website, and trying to make a task, get something done, that may be harder for certain groups of people than others. And so we want to make sure that we are paying attention and making sure that we're providing an easy experience, right? So the great thing is that there's a lot of overlap with UX. And then I do want to just point out that people will tend to say, well, I don't really work with anybody who deals with trauma. Like I don't work with domestic violence survivors or, anything like that. And I'm like, but hang on. I worked at a sports tech startup for 2 years, and I got to interview all kinds of different people, including people who are in the NFL, which is our big football league here in the United States, and these professional athletes and these elite athletes who people would look at and go, wow, like I'm jealous of you. But there was a lot of trauma involved, not only in their personal experiences with their families and the stuff that we all deal with, but even in like the sports world and being treated like a number and things happening like you get traded at 11 at night, you find out about it on social media, you have to get on a plane at 6 in the morning and you leave your wife and you leave your little baby at home because you have to go work somewhere else the next day. So there's just all kinds of different trauma that we need to keep in mind. So like even when I'm designing for people who may seem to be maybe have like a nice deal in life, we could say, we really don't know, right? We just really don't know until we walk in somebody else's shoes. And if you're designing for any kind of website for the general public, like a hospital or the government, you really need to keep this stuff in mind, right? We expect way too much of people who come to our websites. Like unless you're in the field of entertainment, mostly people just want to like get to the website, get the thing done, and be gone, right? And while entertainment's great, we actually need a lot of people to work on these websites that are not particularly glamorous or exciting, but are really super important to people and their well-being. So being in trauma-informed is all about recognizing these different types of trauma that people may have, and it's being careful so that we don't re-traumatize people unintentionally. I do believe that people are absolutely well-meaning and that people aren't intentionally trying to hurt each other. But sometimes we like going so fast in tech. I think we're just not being careful at times when we set up for interviews or thinking about like even just the power dynamics in a certain situation. I also want to call out that trauma-informed is a process. You never like get there. It's always kind of like moving towards being more trauma-informed. It's a change in mindset. Organizations can become more trauma-informed. That's usually a culture change. It takes minimum of 5 years from what I hear from people who've tried to work with organizations to do this. These ideas can take a while to digest. And I will also say that as you work to become more trauma-informed, you're kind of giving up the idea of just getting to be comfortable and not think about this stuff because you typically have to deal with your own trauma throughout the process. So, but it's worth it, because it's going to make a difference for other people. A lot of being trauma-informed is moving from this mindset shift of what's wrong with you, because that's what we've done in the past to people who didn't kind of like act in a certain way. We've heard people say like, what's their problem? Well, that happened to me and it wasn't a big deal, and saying things like that. But it could be a big deal to somebody else, right? So it's having this idea, again, I think back to the first time I ran usability tests, and I think the person acted so different than I thought they would act. I was just like, wow, I would never do that. Like it's just, they're not you, right? You're not the user, and you're not having the same experience somebody else might be having. And so just keeping that in mind. So the way that healthcare has been looking at it and social work's been looking at it is what's wrong with you. They kind of go to like, what happened to you? But that is really because they're often coming from a place of trying to provide therapeutic services. And that's typically not what we're doing, okay? So that's a whole different industry. What we're trying to do is really just figure out like, how can I help you? Like, how can I be helpful to you through this website, through this app, through this research, and make this a positive experience, maybe a healing experience, but perhaps just neutral. And that's what we need to focus on. We actually don't need to know what happened to you. And what I'm going to suggest is that we take on this idea of being trauma-informed as a universal precaution, similar to putting on gloves, which is what doctors and nurses and other people kind of working in those kinds of medical settings will do in order to prevent like transmission of like liquids, right? And they don't ask us when they interact with us, right? So we don't have doctors or nurses coming to us and being like, do you have any diseases? Do you have HIV? Like, should I put on my gloves? Should I not put on my gloves? Like, we don't have these conversations, right? They just wear gloves so that they're not going to transmit disease to us, and we're not going to transmit disease to them accidentally, right? It's just a universal precaution, and nobody like looks at them funny because they're putting on gloves. We go, oh, good, that makes sense. We have on gloves. So I think what we need to start to do is to figure out like, what are the universal precautions for our industry, right? Making your research and designs more trauma-informed is also just going to help more people, right? So similar to curb cuts, which I'm sure y'all have heard this analogy before, right? All about accessibility. You add the cut to the curb so it's easier for a person who may not be sighted to, go across the street. But you also know like that's going to help the parent with the stroller, and it's going to help the delivery person, and it's going to help, when we get the luggage and we're running around town. So the good thing is that we do have some guidance around universal precautions, not necessarily called that exactly, but I do want you to just know that like we can change the way we work in tech. The move fast and break things, let go of that. Facebook's wrong. You could break important things. You could harm people. You could lose trust in people. We have this thing called sprints. We do them all the time. I'm going to suggest maybe we need to slow down sometimes. I don't know about y'all, but in the different jobs I've had, I'm often thrown into a research project. I'm rushed. And I think we need to question sometimes, like, why are we rushing so much? I think we rush analysis and synthesis as well. I think that's a bad idea. And I also know that, in UX and design, sometimes we talk a lot about like, well, people don't know what they want, right? And we talk about Henry Ford, and if you'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And yeah, that's fine. Okay, I'll get that. People can't necessarily articulate what they want, but people do know how they want to be treated and how they want to feel. And that is really important. So we just need to be mindful around this stuff. So I appreciate y'all coming to this talk. So let's think about some principles that can guide us. So we do not have to like go from scratch here, because we have principles. These are SAMHSA Principles. That's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in the United States. There are 2 other groups of principles that have major overlap with these. This just happened to be the group that I have chosen to work with. They came out in 2014. There's another group that came out earlier. There's another group that came out later. But these are the main principles that we think of when we want to take a trauma-informed care approach. And if we had more time together, I would go into each one in detail, which would be lovely, but I can't, not today. But the nice thing is that these apply very much, and they overlap with UX ideas. More and more, they overlap with things that we're talking about already, and even that we're talking about more in the last few years, in like the last 3 years, I feel like, than in the past. As we talk about, for example, peer support is something that from the perspective of trauma-informed care is very much about having somebody with lived experience being able to relate to the person. So if, for example, we have a research participant kind of situation going on, how great is it when the interviewer actually can, in fact, like have some connection with the person who's, maybe sharing their ideas, the one being interviewed with us. Like that is pretty great. How do we make people feel more comfortable in that kind of realm? So I'll give you a total example that's like not particularly like trauma focused, but I remember going in, I was doing usability testing with football players. I didn't play football, but when I went to go do interviews with football players, I brought a football player with me who was the same race of a lot of the football players, because they could talk shop, right? And they could feel more comfortable and know that we were just trying to make the darn product better, not trying to do anything, and just being aware of the power dynamics. So there's these overlaps with UX ideas that I do know we talk about being safe in our work. Certainly if you work with medical devices and that sort of thing, we do talk about like, what does trust mean on websites? So a lot of these principles, we can just start to expand a little bit and maybe spend a little bit more time thinking about how would these work in tech? Unfortunately, like there's not a lot to guide you right now. It's because this is new. We are trying to figure out like how this works. There's one model that you can use to try to apply to your organization. And it's called the Missouri model. And I put a link to it in the resources that you'll be able to dig into. But mostly like when people come to the trauma-informed design group I run, they kind of are like, tell me what to do. And I'm like, I can't, but here are the principles and just figure out how to apply them. And so this is a place where UXers who have a lot of initiative need to really bring that initiative to kind of figure out like, how can we apply this to tech to have more care? Because kind of similar to like, nobody's actually ever told me to do a content audit. I've had to do a lot of content audits, right? And people sometimes will, I've only been asked once, I think, to make personas. I've made personas probably 25 times because I said, this is what this project needs. So it's up to us to kind of say, I think we need to have more care here in our research. We need to pay more attention to how we're building this product. We need to think about safety. We need to think about these things. I'm going to leave you with some practical applications in the last 3 minutes. So first off, anything you can do to reduce cognitive load, anything you can do to reduce the brain power that people need to get something done, this will help them. This will help not only because maybe they have trauma in their past, but maybe they're just tired. So it's going to help everybody by doing things like reducing the complexity of a page, reducing reading levels, keeping it as simple as possible. You need to plan for mobile, right? We know that some people can only access the internet through mobile devices. So this is an equity issue too, right? So the experience needs to be equally good on mobile, like design for mobile first, then back it out into desktop. People in really scary situations who are in midst of trauma, be it a disaster or human trafficking or whatever trauma, they may only have a mobile phone. So that mobile phone needs to work great, and it needs to work well and not be clogged up by like images and things like that, especially if the internet connection is not very good. People in scary situations don't have a lot of time to get help, so we want to be very efficient with what we bring to the table. Broken links are broken promises. You need to be running a broken link checker regularly. It is a trust factor, and it is really critical. So this is an easy thing we can do. We just need to pay attention to our broken links on our websites. Make sure we are not saying you can go somewhere when you really can't go there. I want us in general as an industry to prepare better with care. I know we want to sprint, but I'm saying let's slow down. We hurry, we cut corners. Let's not cut corners when it comes to care for our participant. You can think about questions. Do I really need to do this research? Can I safely do this research? What harm might this research create and how can I mitigate it? It's making sure of being careful of the people who are kind of in your care for that session they happen to sign up for, right? I've sometimes gotten on a session, participants hopped on, they're driving. I'm like, please don't drive. please, like, I'll hang out with you on the phone until you actually get to your house and we can do it then. So it's about being more careful in general about what we're doing. Are there other ways I can get this research done that doesn't require me asking sensitive questions or digging in? What can I build off of already? And finally, I really do believe that having one trauma-informed teammate does make a difference. Like changing a whole system, that's hard, that's a lot of work. But even by having one person on your team, and maybe it's you, to ask those questions to say, wait a minute, let's think about the safety of this. Wait a minute, let me make sure that as I'm setting this up, that my research participants are going to be comfortable. Let me make sure this form is explaining why it's asking this question. Those kinds of things can make a difference and can start to influence the products that we're working on. What we can do, it's worthwhile to do our best to try to start to change things. And then we can start working too on a systemic level to do stuff as well. You can make a difference. We can not harm people. We can support people in healing. And if anybody wants to talk more about this during our next break, which I think is in about 30 minutes after, I'm sure it's going to be another good talk, I'm going to make a table in the social lounge. So I hope that you'll come visit me. There's a list of resources I put on the Bird Call blog. I encourage you to learn what is your ACE score yourself. We have trauma-informed design monthly calls. If you want to join us, we have people from all over the world on them. There's usually like 25 of us on there. It's pretty fun. And so that's it. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time and attention today.